Good evening and welcome to the Orkney International Science Festival online and to this evening's event, the Margaret Flaws Memorial Lecture entitled An Orkney Dynasty, the Search for Kolbein Hruga. My name is Heather Woodbridge and I'll be your speaker host for this evening. Little is known of Kolbein Hruga outwith the Orkneyinga Saga, but Margaret Flaws and Wyre, well known for her studies in Orkney's history, dialect and tradition, gradually pieced together a web of family connections, showing how Orkney's leading families were linked together with rich families in Norway through trade, shipping, and politics. This evening, our speaker, Spencer Rosie, will show us how Margaret traced the various clues and the picture reveals of the wealth and power of the Orkney of the Norse earls, with insight into Sweyn Asleifsson and clues to the ancestry of the Flett family today. So welcome, Spencer. It's a pleasure to have you with us tonight.
Good evening. Thank you.
So for our viewers, history was one of Spencer Rosie's favourite subjects at school, at Kirkwall Grammar School. He went on to study geology at Aberdeen University and then to work in Orkney's oil sector in Florida. But in his spare time, he spent many years researching the memorials in the cathedral, which are the subject of his book, Saints and Sinners. He's also chair of Orkney's Heritage Society. So welcome and really looking forward to your talk this evening. Just a pretty bit of housekeeping before we begin. If anybody is watching and you'd like to ask a question for Spencer, please enter it into the YouTube live chat and we'll come to the questions at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Heather, for that. Could I have the first slide, please? Well, I had the great pleasure in knowing Margaret Flaws for more than half her life. Politics brought us together in 1979 to combat the prospect of uranium mining in Orkney. Could I have the next slide, please? This is Margaret and me on our 80th birthday. Margaret was born on 12th April 1938 and brought up in Bridge Street. Her father, George Arthur, was a baker and keen naturalist who wrote for the Orkney Herald. She was educated at Kirkwall Grammar School and was a bright student. She went on to Edinburgh University and graduated with an MA in English language. With her mother being the teacher in Wyre, she met, fell in love, and married Ian Flaws in 1961. Becoming a teacher herself, she took over the role in Wyre in 1970, with all three of her boys, George, Magnus, and Ian, being among her pupils. Later, she taught at the first school where she developed a system of teaching the Orkney dialect as a language, which became an exemplar for others to follow. Margaret was a published author, collaborating with Gregor Lamb on an Orkney dictionary. She collected nursery rhymes and published them as Kitty Bredo's Orkney Nursery Rhymes. For Orkney Museums, Margaret wrote Thord's Story about a boy living at Kirbister Farm in 1557, which describes his daily life and incorporates the Battle of Abdale when an attack on Kirkwall by an English fleet was repulsed by Arcadian forces under the redoubtable Edward Sinclair. In 2009, she put together the incredible story of her maternal grandfather, who, along with all the staff of the Lerwick Post Office, was wrongly imprisoned at the start of the First World War, suspected of spying for the Germans. Her book, Spy Fever, The Post Office Affair, was extremely well received. Could I have the next slide, please? Within the lands belonging to the Flaws family in the island of Wyre are two archaeological sites that are linked to Orkney's Viking past. A stone castle, the earliest one in Scotland, built by a chieftain called Kolbein Hruga, and a small chapel associated with her son, Bishop Bjarni. Kolbein is a shadowy figure who became part of Orkney folklore as the giant Cubbie. The short form of Kolbein is Cubbie, and the word Hruga is still in use in the dialect today as Ru, meaning a heap. Over the centuries, the castle became just a green mound, but in the 1930s it was excavated At the same time, the chapel near it, also from the 12th century, was repaired and floor cleared. Margaret recounts a Wyre story that in the course of clearing the chapel, men dug a little deeper than they should and found 5 skeletons there, buried underneath the floor. They were well over average size, and it was claimed that one of them was 7 feet 6 inches tall. Allowing for exaggeration, it still indicates a very tall man. Unfortunately, there is no official record of this dig. Now, not much is known about Kolbein. Margaret was determined to find out who he was, saying, "I'm going to try because I feel that if I do not do so, then nobody will. It is just accepted that he was a chieftain in Wyre and that he was a Norwegian. Nobody seems curious to fill in the void behind him. I think Mr. Mooney was, and I mean to try to carry on what he left off." Now, in 1936, John Mooney wrote to the Norwegian historian Einar Sim about Kolbein. The reply came, "But we know nothing about Kolbein but traditions here. We are only hearing about him in the sagas." Now, Kolbein is also mentioned in Heimskringla in the saga of the sons of Harald. Here it is said that he accompanied Eystein, the son of Harald Gilli, over to Norway with Arne Sturla and Thorleif Bjorn Olsen. When they arrived in Trondheim, Eystein was proclaimed king, to add to the already proclaimed kings his brothers, Sigurd and Ingi. Margaret explains the close family connection between Arne, Thorleif, and Eystein. It should also be noted that Ronald Callie Colson was Earl of Orkney at this time. He had been one of King Harald Gilli's staunchest supporters and was friends with all of his sons. Arne was second cousin to Ronald, who likely entrusted the transporting of Eystein from Hebrides to his kinsman. There is, however, no obvious explanation of the presence of Kolbein Hruga, yet it seems that he seems to be given equal status with the others mentioned. Now, nothing is told about his personal life except one anecdote. Kolbein was foster father to Olaf, the son of the infamous Sweyn Asleifsson, which indicates a degree of friendship between them. Olaf was kidnapped by John Wing in retaliation for Sweyn's treatment of his brothers and was taken to Westry. Here they met Earl Ronald, who at once asked Olaf why he was there. Olaf replied that he should ask John Wing. Earl Ronald told John Wing to take the boy back, or Sweyn and Kolbein wouldn't give him any peace in the islands. Kolbein was therefore someone not to be messed with. As Margaret says, it seems from this that Kolbein could be warlike at need, but the period in which he lived necessitated this in any case. But in spite of his friendship with Sweyn, there is nothing to indicate that he went on any of Sweyn's Viking voyages, and he is not among the members of Earl Ronald's crusade. There is no mention of him taking side to any of Earl's quarrels. He seems to have led an eminently peaceful life. The generally accepted view of Kolbein Hruga is that he was a Norwegian chieftain who married the great-granddaughter of Earl Paul Thorfinson and settled in Wyre on Hurry State of Wyre. He is known as a Norwegian for 2 reasons. The first, that he is called that in some versions of the Orkneyinga Saga, particularly in A.V. Taylor's, although he puts the statement into brackets as an alternative reading from different manuscripts. Grab the next slide, please. The second reason is contained in a letter written by his son, Bishop Bjarne, in which he makes an endowment of land at Halland and Galsfjord to Munklev Monastery for the souls of his father's brothers, relatives, and friends. Now, Munklev Abbey was founded in about 1110 and was strategically positioned on the Dublin height above the newly established town of Bergen. It is presumed that this land at Halland was inherited by Bjarne from his father and must prove that Kolbein was a substantial landowner in Norway before leaving to go to Orkney to live. Bjarne would have had no reason to acquire land in Norway for himself, as he seems to have inherited some at least of the land in Orkney that formed the Wyre estate. Thus the suggestion he must have been Norwegian, although no trace of him can be found there, as was noted by the Norwegian historian Einar Schrein, who thought the letter was written in 1195, suggesting the bishop had lost close kinsmen in the Battle of Florabag, but so many Arcadians lost their lives. Now, Margaret examined the Norwegian families living around Halland and Gjalsfjord and found some connections with Orkney. Eastwards from Halland and almost at the head of the Sonja Fjord, there is an estate called Urness. The first name associated with Urness is Gautba Urness, and his ancestry is not possible to trace with any accuracy. He must have been someone of standing in the district, however, and his sons were strong supporters of Harald Gelli's family against King Tver, fighting in 2 sea battles against him, one in Sonja Fjord itself and the second at Florabag near Bergen. So many Arcadians were killed. Gaut was probably about the same age as Kolbein Hruga, and his sons would have been roughly of the same age as Kolbein's sons. Could it be possible that Kolbein was related to Gaut? At Urness, there is a fine stavkirk, which some consider to have been built by Gaut and his family. His name is certainly engraved there in runes, but what is stranger is this inscription. I have the next slide, please. This inscription is read as Magnus in Helgi, Magnus the Holy. Next slide, please. It is concluded that this is St. Magnus Erlendsson of Orkney, and shows a definite link with Orkney, suggesting a connection with the Ayarskegjar and the Battle of Florabag. The author places the date of the inscription in the second half of the 12th century from the type of runes used. There's another kirk near Urness, Stavkirk, a stone-built one. Next slide, please. It lies further up the fjord at Dale, and the date of building suggested as the first half of the 13th century. The stonework has been compared as being similar to that of St. Magnus Cathedral. Some have even inferred a link with Bishop Bjarne to the extent that he may have sent stonemasons there from Orkney. It is difficult from the above connections to come to any other conclusion than that there is a link between Kolbein Hruga's family and Urness, or the district or near it, although the link seems not to be so much with Kolbein himself, but rather his sons, Bjarne and one or more of the others. If Bjarne's letter was written in 1195, as seems possible, it would indicate that more than one of his brothers took part and was killed in the Battle of Florabag against King Tver. It seems likely that they were fighting side by side with their relatives, whom Bjarne also mentions. If that is the case, who were his relatives? Were they from Orkney or from Norway? It was at this point in her research when she felt she was banging her head against a brick wall. A conversation in her kitchen in Wyre changed all that. Her son Ian suggested that she might be looking at the whole question from the wrong angle. The conversation went something like this. Well, mother, why don't you consider that he might have been an Arcadian, and look at it from that point of view? It might not have been his wife's estate that he was living on. It might have been his own. Why no? No sign of him in Norway, you said. Well, there is plenty solid sign of him here. Just look out the window. So she did look at the window at the castle and wondered if he could be right. If he was, then the proof had to come from the Orkneyinga Saga. It is only there that he is referred to as Norwegian. She looked at textual differences in the various versions of Orkneyinga Saga about Kolbein. One of the earliest translations was by Jonas in 1780. Jonas was following the text in Yara book, but in a translation into Norwegian made from that in 1570. It describes Kolbein as en norsk man, a Norwegian man. The phrase en norsk man was not present in Flett book. It is conceivable that it was missed out when copied, but perhaps it was not in the original that was being copied. This the first mention of Kolbein Hruga being Norwegian, and indeed it is the only mention. It is only in this translation of 1570 that this occurs. This translation, however, is generally regarded as being more accurate in many places than Flett book. It is noticeable that Vigfússon renders it as Norrøn rather than Norsk. The two words at the time that Vigfússon was writing had different meanings. Norsk indicated Norwegian in the country of Norway. Norrøn applied to a larger area, including Iceland, Orkney, and Shetland. From this, she thought there was room to doubt whether Kolbein Hruga was a Norwegian. The lack of knowledge about him in Norway points to this conclusion as well. The fact that he is known to live in Wyre and Orkney adds to this, and it would seem unlikely that he would leave an estate in Norway to come and live in Orkney, in spite of the suggestion by a Norwegian historian Olaf Solli that he wanted to escape the civil war in Norway. Margaret thought Orkney would have been no safer at this time, for there seemed to have been plenty of bloodshed as well. Perhaps the translator in 1570 added this definition, placed Kolbein Hruga apart from the many Scots families living in Orkney by that time. In Orkneyinga Saga, there is a list of the leading families in Orkney in Earl Paul Haakonsson's time. There is no mention of Kolbein Hruga's family or of Wyre in that list. If Kolbein were Arcadian and of high standing, as seems certain, he would not otherwise have been able to marry into the Earl's family in Orkney. He or his family should be on that list. There have been suggestions that Bjarni might have written this saga, or at least contributed information, but there is another source that this information might have come from. It is recorded in Sturlunga Saga that Bjarni's nephew, Thorkel Rostunga, stayed in Iceland for some months on a trading voyage in 1202, and this fits in neatly with the projected dates of the writing of the Orkneyinga Saga. If Thorkel was the informant, he would detail as many families as he could remember in an informal chat. It is unlikely that he would bother to detail his own. He would be known to the people he was talking to, and would expect them to know about his own family. Therefore, we cannot take it for granted that because Kolbein's family is not mentioned in that list, he was not an Arcadian. Thorkel himself is described as an Arcadian. On the evidence of statements about Kolbein Hruga in the Orkneyinga Saga, we cannot come to a definite conclusion as to whether he was Norwegian or an Arcadian. It can only be stated that he lived in Wyre. And the only other statement about him in the saga of Sigurd Indian Eystein, son of Harald Gilli, no inference can be made except that he must have been well known to have been mentioned and by nickname only. The proof must lie in Bjarni's letter and the estate in Norway. Bjarni must have inherited this, as there would have been no reason for him to buy land there for himself. Perhaps Bjarni inherited this land from a different source. For that reason, Margaret considered Kolbein's wife. Next slide, please. And her descent from Paul Thorfinnsson, which is detailed twice in the Orkneyinga Saga. Earl Paul was married to a Norwegian, a daughter of Håkon Jarl Ivarsson, and Ragnhild, daughter of King Magnus the Good. Paul and his wife were both descendants of the Amodlings of Isk, one of the great Norwegian families. It therefore could be said that Herbjorg was more Norwegian than Arcadian, if such a definition had any meaning at that time. Many of our relatives lived in Norway, and the ties between the two places were in any case very strong. Margaret reviewed the marriages of all four of Paul's daughters, marrying into Norwegian families. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at the map of Sognefjord to Trondheim families, we see quite clearly a cluster of families with close connections to the daughters of Earl Paul Thorfinnsson. At Gims, number 7 on the map, there is Ingrid married to Einar Orsaka. At Gisk, there is Ragnhild married to Skof Agmundsson, number 2, whose daughter married an Arcadian, Havar Gunnarsson. And finally, at Sognedal, there is Herbjorg married to Serk Bjorn Olsson. It is therefore possible that land at Halland belonged to Ser or was under his jurisdiction. Next slide, please. It is also possible that the estate belonged to Sigrid's husband's family, and that it was through Sigrid herself that the land came to Kolbein Hruga's family. There is no way of proving either hypothesis, but Margaret considered it most likely the land was Sigrid's and then Herbjörg's. Margaret liked to imagine that Sigrid and her daughter Herbjörg fled to Rosie to her sister Ingeborg and her husband Sigurd of Westness. Less than half a mile of water separates Rosie from Wyre, and Herbjörg and Kolbein could probably have met several times before marrying. Although it would appear that Kolbein Hruga was an Arcadian who married a Norwegian and not the other way around, as has been previously believed, it brings us no nearer to finding out his parentage. There is an intriguing statement about Kolbein's son Bjarni, which said that he had plenty of kinsmen in the islands. This could be taken as meaning his mother's kid, since she was descended from Earl Paul. But many of these were in Norway. It is more likely that this statement refers to the fact that he was connected with many of the leading families in Orkney through both his mother and his father. There is only one clue in the saga to indicate any connection of Kolbein Hruga's with another Orkney family, and this is in relation to the previous mention of the kidnapped Olaf, son of Sweyn Asleifsson, and the foster son of Kolbein Hruga. Earl Ronald's advice to the kidnapper was not to mess with either man. Kolbein is never stated as supporting Sweyn in any of his mad adventures. He gets no mention in the saga in connection with Sweyn at all, except this one fact of fostering his son. But the fact that Kolbein is fostering Sweyn's son indicates a close relationship between them, either a friendship or kinship. If they were friends, it would have been likely that Kolbein's name would have been mentioned somewhere in the saga, in the many stories about Sweyn, but this never happens. It seems, therefore, that Sweyn and Kolbein might actually be related in some way. In fact, the earls' coupling of their names in the way he does points in that direction. It would be of benefit to examine whether there are any facts which might point to a kinship between the Gersey and Wyre families. Next slide, please. By examining the nature of the lands owned by the two families and disproving Storer Knudsen's theory that Sweyn held his lands as Vesla, which were estates given from earldom land in return for supporting Earl against his enemies, Margaret found that Sweyn must have held his lands outright, inheriting the lands from his father Olaf and grandfather Rolf, the original holder of these lands. Margaret speculates that the original lands held by Rolf extended from Garsland on the border between what is now Evie and Rendell, and included a great part of the parish of Rendell. When Olaf, Rolf's son and father to Sweyn, stated as being in Gersey, his brother Helgi is at Tingwell, so it can be concluded that originally Tingwell was also part of the Rolf's estate. The estate would have been split on the death of Rolf. Possible to conjecture that it extended much further. The next part of the coast after Garsland takes us to Woodwick, and the prebend of Our Lady of Woodwick contained the land at Dyke, which is not far from the boundary with Costa. None of these lands were connected at the time of Rolf with any other leading family, so it is quite possible that he held them all. Thus, at his death, they would be split among his immediate family, Olaf in Gersey and Rendell, Helgi at Tingwell, and a further son in Wyre and Evie. The proximity of the estates and the fact of Kolbein Hruga being foster father to Sweyn's son Olaf suggests the connection, plus the lack of any mention of another leading family in the area. That none of these lands were held as Vesla is demonstrated by the fact that the Gersey estate on the death of Sweyn was divided between his sons Olaf and Andreas. If it had been Vesla, it would have reverted to Earl Harold Maridson. The same would have happened to the Wyre Woodwick estate, but we can assume that it was private property also by the fact that Bjarni established the prebend of St. Peter on Wyre, and probably also the prevent of Our Lady of Woodwick. He could not have assigned lands to this purpose if they had been earldom lands. If this is the case, then it is possible that all these lands were originally Rolf's and were divided on his death between 3 sons. This would mean that the chieftain in Wyre was also a Rolf's son, Kolbein Hruga, a first cousin of Sweyn Asleifsson. Yet there is no mention of this at all in the saga. If Kolbein Hruga is accepted as being Arcadian and closely linked with the Gersey family, the name Kolbein needs an explanation. An Icelandic origin has been suggested, and that Kolbein might belong to the family of Vala Brander, who lived in the south of Iceland. Kolbein Flaws' son was a lawgiver in Iceland in 1066 for 6 summers. This was a high position and indicates he was an important man. His grandfather, Vala Brander, was descended from some of the original settlers in Iceland who had come from the west of Norway. The name Bjarni came from its wife's side. There were strong trading links between Orkney and Iceland. St. Magnus's mother was from Iceland, for example. In Iceland, there was already market for Orkney meal, and indeed there is an account of a trading voyage made by Kolbein Hruga's grandson, Thorkel Rostunga, to Iceland with a cargo of meal. It would not be unusual, therefore, for the owner of a large estate in Orkney to establish a trading link with Iceland in order to sell any surplus grain he might have. It is therefore likely, considering the size of Rolf's estate in Orkney, that he would have a surplus to trade, and the connection to Iceland could be made. So it is well within the bounds of possibility that one of his sons could marry someone from Iceland. Margaret considered there is a strong case for Kolbein Hruga's father to have married an Icelander, and indeed a descendant of Vala Brander, when the names Kolbein and Bjarni are considered. Kolbein Hruga's son, Bishop Bjarni, certainly had strong links with Iceland. Margaret examined all these links and the possibility that Bjarni was the source for much of the information in Orkneyinga Saga, the composition of which is very much linked to the intellectual centre at Oddi in southern Iceland. Margaret looked closely at the family living there, the Oddaverayar, excuse me for my pronunciations, and their connections with Orkney. Sweyn Frody, the learned Sigvason, is the first figure of note in the family. He married Gudrun, a member of the Vala Brander family. He made Oddi into a centre of learning and culture in the latter half of the 11th century. His grandson, John Lopson, adopted Snorri Sturluson, Iceland's greatest scholar, at an early age and was responsible for his education. John had 2 sons, Saemund, who became the next chieftain at Oddi, and Paul, who became a bishop. Paul is said to have visited Orkney, and Saemund was contracted to marry a daughter of Earl Harold Madison, though it never happened. Kolbein Hruga's grandson, Thorkel Rostunga, sought refuge with Saemund after falling out with Snorri Sturluson. He was able to seek refuge here because of Saemund's friendship with Bishop Bjarni. Saemund would not come to Orkney to marry the Earl's daughter, so the friendship with Bjarni must have stemmed from Iceland. Margaret concluded that there is circumstantial evidence that Kolbein Hruga's mother came from Iceland, the most conclusive being the use of the names Kolbein and Bjarni and the continuing friendship between Kolbein's family and Oddi. We then went on to look at Kolbein's descendants. There is a list of his children in Orkneyinga Saga: Kolbein Karl, Bjarni, Samaradi, Aslak, and Frida. Margaret examined what is known about Bjarni as a diplomat, builder, skald, and poet. She also looked at his love life and discussed celibacy in the medieval church. One of the clauses in his letter regarding the lands at Halland in Norway was that a woman, Agnes, shall have 8 months' amount of food from it every year of her life. This was the normal method of reckoning rent at that time. Now, was Agnes a daughter or a concubine? Margaret looked at the Rostungs, Thorkel Rostung being a son of Kolbein Karl. She examined all the records of the nickname Rockstone Walrus, means walrus, being used in the medieval period. She looked at the Kolbein son Lang family, which were said to be kinsmen of Bishop Bjarni. Sigvat Kolbein's son, for example, became the lawman of Orkney. Finally, on the genealogical theme, Margaret looked at the beginnings of the Rendell family. Kolbein Hruga's daughter, Frida, married Andreas, son of Sweyn Asleifsson. They had 3 sons, Rolf Ketling, Kolbein of Rendell, and Gunni. Kolbein of Rendell being first of the Rendells. Margaret tells an interesting family story. She says, my aunt was married to James Rendell of Midgarth in Rendell, and he told me that his family had at one time been an important one in Orkney. One of its ancestors had served King Haakon when he became ill in Orkney after the Battle of Largs, and was presented with a glass by him for the service he had done for him. I was shown this glass, but alas, over the centuries, the glass had disappeared and the memory had been transferred to a 17th century shot glass. It is interesting to note, with reference to this story, that when King Haakon was dying in Kirkwall, he directed that gold and silver be given to its retainers, and that his household items were to be divided between those who served him. Concluding her findings, she said Kolbein Hruga was not a Norwegian, but an Arcadian. He was part of the Adel, or aristocracy, and was very rich. He was not a Viking, but he was a merchant. Kolbein was part of an Orkney family which stretched from Rolf in the 11th century through Olaf, Helgi, and Kolbein's father, to Sweyn and Kolbein to the 14th century, at least in Norway, and to the present day in Orkney. She thought they were worthy of the title of Dynasty. The next slide, please. Now, Kolbein's estate on Wyre, and I'm sorry for the quality of this photograph. Kolbein's estate on Wyre was high status, and Margaret was able to give a glimpse into life at the time of Kolbein through some of the artefacts found on the island, such as a hawk's bell found at the castle and a piece of chainmail found in the chapel. A recent archaeological review of the castle found a good example of a brew oven, which we see here. Margaret was thus able to discuss the rules and philosophy around drinking in saga times. In the course of searching through the family trees for relatives of Earl Paul and his daughters, Margaret came across a name which intrigued her, Harold Flett. Her grandmother was a Flett. She got sidetracked immediately and wondered if here there might be an answer of the Fletts in Orkney. So as an appendix, she examined the genealogy of the Flett family in Orkney and the relationship to the Earls family in the 12th century. She concluded that the area of Netherborough and Harry may have been given to the family by Earl Paul Haakonson in compensation for a lost estate in Stronte. Fletts have been living in this area for many centuries. Another person interested in the Fletts is Dr. Jim Wilson, who has been doing extensive DNA research in Orkney. As his mother is a Flett, he was particularly interested in the family, which can trace their DNA back to Hordaland. Interestingly, he found one of the branches of the Fletts of Netherborough, are not, in fact, related to the other Fletts. But he traced the anomaly back to the 17th century. He put this down rather quaintly in a lecture given last year to an uncan bull in the byre. One of 3 possible women in the 17th century slept with someone outside the family. And he even identified the uncan bull, someone with the surname Talia. Science can certainly uncover things that perhaps facts might get hidden. Now, for thousands of years, Orcadians have been paying homage to their ancestors, often in spectacular fashion. In pre-Christian Norway and Iceland, the ancestor cult was a highly significant part of people's religious belief. The original farmer who broke out the land had a special status. I think Margaret's work can be seen in this vein, paying homage to the builder of the castle that Margaret saw every day of her life on Wyre. And what is so satisfying about her work is that it was not written in any library or academic institution, but in a farmhouse on the very land Kolbein Hruga once owned. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely fascinating. I've been taking notes. Really, really interesting. Thank you so much for joining us. We've had a few questions come in, but I've got a question for you. Obviously, a really powerful family, really, really influential pairings, with the marriages, spanning different countries. But Kolbein Hruga, he was a really influential figure, was quite, and I'm just curious about the name Hruga, and you talked about that being a dialect, for mound, and is that related to the name Rosie, Hruga Zoe? And I was just curious if what you thought about that.
I think Rosie comes from Rolf's Island, so I don't think that's linked.
Not linked.
Thousand of Hruga, it's just the Norse means just a big, and of course that it translated into dialect to a rug, that big heap of stuff. So he was obviously described as a big man, and hence probably where the folklore tale of Cubbie being a giant came from.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, that's really, really, really interesting. We've got a couple of questions coming in. I've got one from Julie saying, what a work that Margaret did. How long did she spend researching Kolbein, and do you think there may be a missing written source mentioning Kolbein somewhere? And she says possibly in Iceland.
Yeah, she spent the last 3, 4, 5 years of her life researching, first of all, Bishop William the Old, and then Kolbein Hruga and her family. We corresponded a bit about it, about our the works we were both working on. And I remember being very frustrated about Kolbein Hruga and coming up with a brick wall, and then her son Tufi, as he's called, coming up with the idea, well, why don't you think on the aspect of being an Arcadian? I think that changed everything. And her arguments are very, very well put together. We'll probably never know for sure, but there's certainly strong links, obviously, with Bjarni and Iceland. So I know that she had been in contact with various people, and Margaret had the advantage of being able to read Norwegian and understand Icelandic. So she was able to go back to the original sources and certainly some of the older records. And so she certainly put together quite a good arguments that hopefully might be helpful for future researchers.
Oh, thank you. Got another comment from Bill, and he says, an interesting piece of research. Thank you, Spencer. Has anybody researched all the oddly named places in Orkney to see how many more Cubbie might be explained as Scandinavian names? And that's from Bill.
Well, Gregor Land did a bit on the Cubbie names, and he kind of challenged the links, some of these names with Kolbein Hruga or the Cubbie. But of course, Cubbie was known as a giant who threw stones all over the place, and some of that's maybe related to that side of it. But yeah, Gregor Land, he wrote a bit on this.
Oh gosh, fascinating. And I really love looking at the Orkney names, and you can see the Scandinavian influence quite clearly if you sort of dig into it indeed. I think we're sort of coming towards the end of the session, unfortunately, but it's been really, really interesting. But perhaps we've got time for just one more. And we've got another question that's come in asking, has there been any DNA on the Cubbie skeletons that could be traced to their descendants? And she asks, or were the skeletons lost?
Yes. Sadly, the Margaret heard this story from the Wiremen firsthand, and there's no reason to doubt it that they did discover skeletons, but unfortunately there was no archaeological work done or record of it, and there's not been any further digging done there. So there is huge scope for archaeological digs, certainly around the castle, to try and trace things better. But interesting you should say about the DNA. One thing that Jim Wilson mentioned in his lecture, which I was very excited about, is the possibility of getting some DNA from Magnus's bones in the cathedral, which would be absolutely fascinating to see if any living descendants here today.
Gosh, that would be really exciting to find a descendant living in Orkney today. Gosh. We've got maybe time for just one more question coming in. And this is a question from Howie. He's asking, well, he says, the picture of the Norse area is often about the conflict between rival earls. Does Margaret's research open up a bit more of a balanced picture of Norse Orkney in which trading and farming play an important role?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it emphasises it that most of the leading landowners they wanted peace and stability. We had in Orkney we had a kind of this anomaly of Sweyn Asleifsson who went off on his Viking villages, but he wasn't typical of the other leading families in Orkney at the time. In Norway, the Viking age ended 1066 with the death of King Harald Hardrade. Of course, in Orkney, it continued to 1171 or whatever. Sweyn was killed in Dublin, but Kolbein was probably much more typical, and that's why the leading landowners may have intervened in some of the disputes between the various earls, such as Magnus and Hakon, and told them in no uncertain terms to get themselves sorted out. They wanted peace and stability.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Gosh, fascinating stuff. I'm sorry we have to come to an end. We're running out of time, but I just want to say thank you again so much, Spencer, for a fascinating talk. It really has been a pleasure having you this evening, and thank you to everybody who's been asking questions. It's really been a really interesting discussion. So thank you all. So for any viewers, at 9 p.m. we have Sagas and Seascapes to come, which is an event with music and interviews with composers influenced by the heritage and landscapes of the Old Norse territories. It will include music from Orkney and the Faroes, as well as Ireland and mainland Scotland. And at 9:30, we'll have the first session of the Festival Club, where you can chat with your friends and hopefully some of our speakers from throughout today as well. And there should be a direct link on the web and on the YouTube pages. But in the meantime, good evening, thank you for watching, and goodbye.